welcome to episode 87 or 88, Brett. As I'm saying this, I can't remember.
87 today.
87 of the Skippers View podcast. My name is Dean.
My name
This
is
is
Brett.
Brett, and we have today with us Keith O'Brien, who is a New York Times bestselling author. Some of his works include Paradise Falls, the story of an environmental catastrophe, Fly Girls, which I actually bought right after I've found your website. So I'm a big history buff, so I'm a history teacher, so I snagged that. And then Outside Shot. So we're here to talk about Charlie Hustle, which is your newest book about Pete Rose that comes out March 26th.
That's right. Thanks for having
Awesome.
me, guys.
Yeah, so thanks for coming on. I guess just a quick note, this is being recorded in January. Book comes out in March. We're going to release this a few weeks prior to the book coming out. So hopefully nothing crazy happens between now and March, but we'll talk about everything. So before we talk about the book itself, I always find it fun when we talk to these authors, like, what does your next month look like? Because I assume you're going on some sort of press tour, a book tour, or going to be doing a lot of these. So what does it look like?
Yeah, well, the launch will be pretty busy. Obviously, I'll be talking to as many folks as I can about the book, doing interviews, and I have a pretty robust tour schedule across New England, the Midwest, and a little bit of the South. So, I'll be out there. Um, trying to tell people about this story, and so it'll be a pretty busy time.
And are you in Maine right now?
I'm based in New Hampshire,
Okay.
about an hour and a half north of Boston.
Okay. Okay. Nice. And you're originally from Cincinnati?
I am, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're going to get into. First off, book is awesome. I think you really lay out his just his entire life, start to finish, good, bad, ugly, all of it. I have and had my opinion on Pete Rose prior to reading this, and I I think it's probably shifted a little, especially the ending and all the interactions you had with people, or all the conversations you had with Pete Rose, and kind of the way he views the whole situation, which we'll get to. But as a Cincinnati guy, was that the motivation behind writing this? Like, you just grew up watching him?
So, I mean, yes and no. You know, Obviously, I grew up in Cincinnati in the 1970s and 80s. So I'm too young to remember the Big Red Machine years. They were a little bit before my time. But I'm in the wheelhouse of my childhood love for baseball when he returns, is traded back to the Reds in August 1984, and I'm there for everything afterwards. The Ty Cobb hit, his managerial years, and then of course the scandal in 1989, which is really for Cincinnatians and I think for baseball was a record scratching moment, frankly. And so that's a big part of the background of my childhood and my childhood fandom of sports. But I'm 50 years old now. I've been a journalist and historian for a long time, and you don't just always write about things that you like. Not everything that you like is necessarily a really great book topic. The reason why this struck me as a really great book topic is because I feel like his story was never properly captured. And I want to be very careful about how I say that, because there's been a lot of books written about Pete Rose. I've read them. Many of them are quite good. Um, what I mean by that is I see Pete Rose and his story as a true tragedy. And I mean that in like the Shakespearean way. Um, this is a tragedy that just happened to unfold in and around a baseball diamond in Cincinnati. In order to capture, a Shakespearean tragedy or a Greek tragedy, you need to bring your character to the mountaintop. You need to bring him there, and then you need to watch him fall. And I felt like that had never really been captured here. And so, when I sort of wrap my mind around that, that's when I set out to tell this story and write this book, Charlie Hustle.
Yeah, and I think I'm gonna wait 'cause so much about people like just I guess what everyone wants to talk about is the fall, right? But I want to talk about the rise in the baseball player first, but I want to talk about the research because I was looking at your notes page, which I wish I had the book. It was a PDF, so I just hold up my iPad. But I think page 336 to 412 is just all the reference notes that you have. Just talk about that research and all the people that you talk to. And is there one person in particular outside of Pete Rose that you really enjoyed kind of sitting and interviewing?
Well, so when I take on a project, I'm gonna throw everything at it, and so obviously, I wanted to talk to as many people as possible. I'm fortunate that many of those folks are still alive, and so there were a lot of people to interview. Um, and again, in all spectrums of Pete's life, you've got his teammates, you've got guys he played against, you have his family, you have the people who investigated him at Major League Baseball in 1989, and you have his inner circle of guys who were, essentially keeping his secrets and placing his bets on baseball. And so, my goal from the outset here was to get as deep into this world as possible. Because again, in order to really capture why anyone would care at all about Pete Rose's fall, you have to understand who he was to begin with. And I think that's again something that's sort of been lost over the last 35 years. We've really forgotten who Pete was before the fall. Because everything in the last 35 years, essentially, it feels like has been just one controversy after another. So, I
Mhm.
set out to interview all of those folks. Obviously, I set out to find court records. A great many people in Pete's life during the fall, during his scandal in 1989, his troubles with gambling, were involved in other criminal matters. And so there is thousands of pages of federal court documents that exist not just about Pete Rose, but about the people who were around Pete Rose, his closest friends. And so I wanted to see those documents. And then, of course, I did want to interview Pete Rose himself. Um, and, I was lucky, you know, because I'm from Cincinnati, born and raised, haven't lived there in a long time, but born and raised. I know people there, and I began in the early part of my research just interviewing people on the west side of Cincinnati, interviewing people from Pete's neighborhood, and you know, after some time. Folks finally offered to introduce me to Pete Rose, and Pete was willing to speak with me, and I was able to record 27 hours of interviews with Pete Rose before ultimately he did stop calling me back. He did ultimately shut down. And I'm sure the next question would be like, well, why? Why did Pete Rose stop calling you back? I I don't know. I don't know. But we never had a falling out. But I can say this, you know, this isn't this book isn't a pay-in to Pete Rose. This book
Yeah.
isn't a hagiography, gilding the mythology of Pete Rose. Um, you know, I was asking him some hard questions, and I think perhaps after a while he didn't want to answer those questions anymore. But I don't really know.
Well, so my question wasn't going to be why he stopped, but I was going to ask, like, because I saw that he no longer was returning your calls. Did that change at all, kind of like the trajectory of the book? Because again, it's a full story of his life, and like you said, I don't think it's really not meant to. You're left to make your own opinion. I think if you read the book, when you read the book, or listeners read the book, you're really like left to make your own opinion. My opinion did change a little once I finished it, but for you, like meeting with him, talking with him, like, and then not talking with him, did that change at all? Kind of like the way you were writing?
So obviously, when you get access to a person, any person, and you're able to do interviews with any person, you do learn more about their motivations, their fears, their desires, their interests. Absolutely. So, and that's true of anybody. So when you're able to ask people questions, you're able to get some answers and able to get some understanding at times. And so, talking to Pete did absolutely help in that regard. The fact that he stopped talking to me, didn't change anything for me. Obviously, it made my job a bit more difficult at times, but it didn't change anything about how I was setting out to tell the story, or what I was trying to do here. My goal, again, from the start, and I'm glad you sort of um, caught on to that, Dean, is you know one of the thing that's happened over the years with books that have been written about Pete Rose is they tend to take a side. There have been there were some books that were written right after his banishment from baseball in 19 because of their proximity to the scandal when they came out. The tone of those books is generally pretty negative. And there have been, of course, many books written over the years that Pete Rose has written himself or hired writers to write for him. And those books are very self serving. So you have this one view that's negative, you have this other view that's very self serving. What I wanted to get to was that part in the middle. Write this story, report this story, and then let people, as you said, come to their own conclusions. Let them read the book and decide, what they think.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I when I got my master's in history, I remember writing a paper that was very one-sided in favor of Theodore Roosevelt, and my professor just kind of ripping it up and saying, "You need to write it so that the person who's reading it can come to their own conclusion." And when I was reading your book, I was like, "Yep, this is exactly that." It is just, I mean, again, so like the beginning, we'll talk about Pete Rose, the baseball player, because he, I mean, it's crazy that he even made the major leagues. I didn't have the quote. I had it and then I lost it. I think it was he can't throw, he can't run, he can't hit,
He, do,
can't do anything
he doesn't have
essentially.
a good arm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he still somehow by luck and knowing the right people kind of makes his way through the red system. And then I guess he was
Yeah.
playing in Elmira or upstate. He was upstate in New York. He's all over the place, but he ends up
Geneva, New
making his way
York.
up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is to me part of why it's important to tell this story this way. Again, why do we care about the fall is because we once cared about the rise. And, to your point, Dean, Pete was frankly sort of a miracle. He never should have, you know, been a major league ball player, much less the all-time hit leader. I mean, this was a young man who in the 1950s was never the best player on his own team. Not once. Not in Little League, not in Legion Ball, not in high school. Never the best player on his own team. When he was a senior in high school and the scouts came to Western Hills, the school he attended on the west side of Cincinnati, to inquire about their star athletes, they asked about Pete Rose. And the coach of West High told scouts that they shouldn't bother looking at Pete. He was too small. As the coach would say, all Pete Rose could do was bunt. And he graduates high school and or is about to graduate high school and has no plan, uh, no job prospects really, and but he did have a certain connection. His uncle Buddy Blowbaum, his mother's brother, his uncle Buddy, was a former minor league ball player who had briefly had some success in the 1930s playing in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and had come back to Ohio, as many people did at that time, back home to Cincinnati, and he got a job at a factory. But while he was in Cedar Rapids, Uncle Buddy, Pete's uncle, became friends with a man named Phil Segui. And Phil Segui um, was also not a very good baseball player, but he had a very long minor league career, and became a manager in many minor league ball clubs, and ultimately got the job as the farm director, essentially minor league director, of the Cincinnati Reds in the late 1950s. And who does Phil Segui hire as a scout? Well, Buddy Blowbaum. And so, Pete in his fifth year in high school, because he did take him 5 years to get through high school, um, you know, is playing ball, just within this, like, a men's league, essentially, somewhere between Dayton and Cincinnati. And that spring, he does hit the cover off the ball. He has an incredible spring. He bats almost 500, and Uncle Buddy puts in a call and says, "You should check out my nephew." And you know, almost as a favor, Phil Segui signs him, Pete Rose, to essentially a peanuts contract, nothing, $7,000, and sends him to the lowest rung of the Reds minor league system, Geneva, New York.
I think the one thing I got from that was it was similar to we read a Ted Williams book recently. It's similar to like the Ted Williams Mike Piazza, like the favor that gets him all the way to the league. But Pete Rose loved Pete Rose and baseball, right? If he didn't
Correct.
have baseball, like you said, he had nothing. I mean, what was it, freshman year, sophomore year? He didn't make the football team, and then he just kind of I mean, he wasn't that smart of a guy in the sense of academics. I think Pete Rose's story, like in terms of like, his dad was abusive but supportive, right?
Well, Pete would never say that. Pete loved his dad, um, but I think, yes, he put a ton of pressure on Pete Rose, on his son. Pete's job was to perform, was to succeed, and Pete was once asked much later, actually right after he broke Ty Cobb's record, the morning after he broke Ty Cobb's record, Phil Schaap, sorry, excuse me, Dick Schaap, formerly of ABC Sports. Dick Schaap asks Pete Rose the morning after, he's like, "What would you do without baseball?" And Pete said, "I think I'd be in the crazy house," and I think that's true about Pete.
So he makes it through the minor. I mean, he kind of shoots up relatively quick. He ends up going to Florida, correct?
Yes, yeah. He
He goes
plays
to New York,
3 years.
Florida.
He plays 3 years in the minor leagues. A ball, 2 years, and to be clear, just to listeners, these are rungs of baseball that don't even exist anymore. I mean, this is back when teams had, like, 6, 7, farm clubs. He was playing his first couple years on the lowest of the low. And that first year, he does okay. The second year down in Tampa, he has a much stronger year. He leads the Florida State League in triples. He sort of, you know, for the first time realizes that maybe he has something here. And then he goes to Macon, Macon, Georgia, for his third year, and has yet another strong year. And it's in that spring of his fourth season where he sort of jumps the line, and moves ahead of a couple of infielders that people thought were in front of Pete Rose. We're going to get called up to the club before Pete Rose. And, you could argue that, obviously in hindsight, they called up the right guy, of course. But at the time, it wasn't nearly as clear. And the reason why Pete Rose ultimately gets the call instead of a couple of other guys is because, Fred Hutchinson, the manager of the Reds, loved Pete's hustle. And it's the first time, in the spring of 1964, 63, that this word starts to get used around Pete Rose. He hustles a lot. He hustles. I like his hustle. And the sports writers, who were a lot like Pete Rose, they were, this was back when the baseball media was all men, all whites, mostly working class, just like Pete Rose. They loved it. They loved him, and they sort of helped build this mythology from a very early day. And Fred Hutchinson loves him. The press loves him. Pete gets the nod. Spring of 19.
Yeah, so he breaks in, wins Rookie of the Year, has personal success. Team doesn't have success for about a decade, though, right? I mean, they weren't the Reds themselves. You said you're 50, so like you said, you were kind of a little young for that, but they weren't great for those first what 8, 9 seasons.
Yeah, I mean they make the World Series in 1970, but it's sort of a fluke. They don't do very well. They lose 4-1 to the Orioles. And it's really but that's really the beginning though. That 1970 year is the beginning. The Reds become a good team in 19.
And obviously you talk about Hustle, Charlie Hustle. That's what he's known for. But in your research and talking to Pete Rose and talking to his teammates and talking to his friends, like Pete Rose, the baseball player, other than hustling, which everyone he's got the 4,000 hits. He is a crazy person. But what about his game do you appreciate more after writing and researching this book?
Strictly about his game, well, I would say three things. The first is I think it's more than just hustle. Um, you know, everybody who played with him or against him, announcers again who I interviewed who are still alive, who were there when he played harder than guys back then. And this is a common complaint today among fans. Oh, they don't work very hard. They don't run very hard. It doesn't look like they care that much. This is a complaint that fans in 2024 have. Well, you know, even back in the 1960s and 70s, there were some fans who thought that. And this was a time when guys were playing hard, where they didn't have a guaranteed contract. They didn't have, a 5-year deal. They were playing every day for the next year's salary, for the next year's contract. That was life and death. And so guys did play, with a bit more urgency, let's just say. And Pete even made them look like they weren't. So I don't even know how he would fit in today's game, to be honest with you. Two, Pete told me once that he was greedy, and he meant that in a good way. He said that, if he said a lot of guys, come up and they get 2 hits to start the game, they're 2 for 2, and it's Tuesday night in June, right? It's not like, the pennant race or anything. And they're like, I'm good. I'm 2 for 2. Even if I go 0 for 2 my next 2 at bats, I'm good for the night. I'm batting 500 tonight. And Pete never had that mindset. He went 2 for 2. He wanted to go 3 for 3. He went 3 for 3. He wanted to go 4 for 4. If he came up in the last at bat of a game that the Reds were losing 7-1 on a Wednesday night in August, with nothing on the line, he wants to get a hit. He was greedy. And I would say one more thing about him. Bill the Spaceman Lee, the longtime pitcher for the Red Sox and the Expos. He faced Pete Rose, of course, during the 1975 World Series. And then would face him later after Spaceman went to the Expos and was now in the National League. And Bill told me that Pete was harder to get out when he had 2 strikes on him. And, the Spaceman said that was rare. He said, most guys go down in the hole. They get 2 strikes. Now you can play with them. Now you can, you can mess with them. You can put it in the dirt. You can put it outside. You can put it high. You can make them chase. And he said that's when Pete got harder to get out, is when he had him at 2 strikes. Spaceman actually told me he loved it if he could get Pete to swing at a first pitch.
Question: did that urgency and we don't want to use the word hustle, urgency and just like ultra competitiveness hurt his legacy amongst his peers?
In general, no. I mean, let's be honest. Time sands off all the edges, right? And so it's easy to forget old grievances, decades later.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, I mean, you know, Did people like playing against Pete Rose? No, no, they didn't. You know, uh, were Ray Fosse's teammates in the American League locker room upset the night that Pete barreled into him at home plate in the 1970 All Star Game? Yeah, some of them were. Um, was were Buddy Harrelson's Mets teammates upset when Pete took Buddy out during the 1973 playoffs? Yeah, they were. If you were on Pete Rose's team, you never felt that way about him.
My dad was actually telling me the Buddy Harrelson story before, how he ran. They used to play the games over the loudspeaker at school. We're from New York, so they used to play the games from over the loudspeaker at school, and he ran home to go watch, and it was just his mom screaming and cursing Pete Rose's name because he just whatever he did to Buddy Harrelson in that moment. So that's funny that we bring that up. Three World Series, an MVP, Rookie of the Year. Not too many Silver Sluggers, two, but that's because the award didn't come around, correct? And two
Yeah.
Gold Gloves. So we all know how great of a player he was. I want to shift slightly to kind of Pete Rose. We don't need to go into detail about the controversies, but how'd you navigate? Like you said, you asked him the tough questions, right? So how'd you navigate asking those tough questions to him, and then kind of like talking to his peers as well?
I mean, I just asked the questions. You know, at this point, there's no reason to hold back. I mean, when I was interviewing him, he was 80 years old. He's now going to be turning 83 this spring. If there's a time to reckon with the past, well, that time is now. I just asked the questions. One of the key things I wanted to get into here uh, was why. You know, why did he do it? Why did he bet on baseball? Why did he lie about it? Because I think ultimately, and my reporting shows this, it was the lying that was more problematic, frankly, than the act, as it often is in life.
He didn't own it in any way, right? He just doubled down.
He didn't, and and he still can't really wrestle with this now, and you know I think I do understand why, and I'm not mitigating it at all. What I really learned is that same tenacity that made him so successful on that field. When he had two strikes, that same feeling he would have that you're not going to beat me, um, is ultimately what led him into trouble off the field. He believed that he could do anything, and that feeling that he could do anything or beat anything, um, ultimately, led him to success on the field and really to his ruin off the field. In particular, in 1989, when these gambling allegations came to light, and he had a chance to tell the truth, and he didn't. And once he dug his heels in and didn't tell the truth, then it was very Pete Rosian that he would not tell the truth then for another 15 years, and in some ways really still isn't telling the full truth today.
As we were doing it, as I read the book also, I thought a lot about like Michael Jordan, with just that addiction to gambling that really just comes from that addiction of competition. So that's kind of what the question I was going to ask. Do you think he was addicted to gambling, or do you think he was just addicted to just competition all the time? Because that's more the vibe I get, is that he was just a guy that constantly needed to be in some sort of win or lose situation.
I'm not a licensed social worker or a therapist or psychiatrist or psychologist. I can't diagnose him. I won't try. But I will say this. One of the signs of any addiction is when you lose sight. You lose sight of what's important in order to chase your addiction. whether that's drinking or drugs or gambling. And 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 again, I'm not a doctor, but objectively speaking, Pete did lose sight of what was important in order to chase, his next day's, wagers. And so I think in that sense, in my layman's opinion, uh, he was addicted, and that's another thing that comes out in my reporting. I spoke to people who were in Pete's inner circle. I'm talking about, three guys who placed his bets on baseball. I'm talking about his best friend that he still goes to the racetrack today. The guy that he goes to, spend the afternoon at the racetrack with back in the 1970s and 80s, still today. And you know, all of them thought that Pete was addicted at that time.
And we can cut this out, but I just want to bring it up because I think it's important. Like when we talked to Poznanski, he felt that the thing holding Pete Rose back at this point was the controversy with the younger girl earlier on in his life. So are you comfortable talking about that?
Yeah, it's part of the book.
Okay.
Yeah, I did a lot of
Yeah,
reporting
no,
around
I
it.
just I will. Yeah, I just wasn't sure because I read. I'm going to read a quote from later on in the book. This comes from the end. I think it's like it's one of the last pages. I'm pretty sure. I hurt me. I hurt my family. And for guys to say he hasn't been punished enough, well, what's enough? 31 years, $100 million. That's enough. Come on. The guy who shot the Pope got out, which made me giggle when I was reading it. But it is kind of true. And I think the reason I was so excited about this book and reading about it is I don't like gambling. I don't like sports gambling. I don't like the way that sports gambling has kind of become so mainstream, both within I think it's targeted towards kids. That's a totally different discussion. But you turn on TV now, or you turn on a baseball game, and there's just gambling advertisements all over the place. So for me, I still feel like at this point, the way that the sport has embraced gambling, the view of Pete Rose should be different. But I think what Poznanski pointed out, what you do a lot of writing about, and what I now kind of realize is that situation that he had early on. Is that? Do you think I'm rumbling over my words? Do you think that is really the big issue right now, holding him back from, say, the Hall of Fame?
I think it's an issue, 100%, absolutely. I also think that prior to those, prior to us learning that he was having a relationship with a teenage girl in the 1970s, prior to that happening, he was not getting into the Hall of Fame. You know, there have been many conversations between Pete Rose and Major League Baseball, going back to 2004, 2003, when he started to finally crack a little bit and say, okay, I'm willing to admit something. And it's just never gone anywhere. The fact of the matter is, you know, Pete has been his own worst enemy time and again. And so I think the reality of the situation is that for as long as he is alive, he's not getting in. That bargain has been made. It's done. It's sealed. To me, the question about the Hall of Fame for Pete Rose or any other player, I think should be a bigger philosophical one. It's a question really between life and art. Are we putting people into the Hall of Fame, Cooperstown, or any other athletic Hall of Fame because of the lives that they've lived, or are we putting them in because of the art they created? This question was identified by Bart Giamatti, the commissioner of baseball. And he identified it actually on the day that Pete was banned from baseball in August 1989. because at the time, in August 1989, Pete was eligible for the Hall of Fame. There was no rule that barred him from the Hall of Fame by being banished. And so he fully believed the day that he signed that agreement that he would be on the ballot for the Hall 2 years later in 1991. Um, but about 10 months before his name would have gone on that ballot, the Hall of Fame changed the rule and said that a player who was permanently ineligible could not receive votes, and that sort of put us into this uh, limbo land with Pete Rose that we exist in 35 years later. But that bigger question about life and art was one that was asked that day by the press. The press asked Bart Giamatti. They said, "What will we do with Pete Rose when he comes up on the ballot 2 years from now?" And Giamatti, who was an incredibly smart man, gone too soon, said that uh, they would have every chance to vote for Pete Rose, that he would do nothing to influence their votes. And he said he looked forward to seeing how they judged life and art. And I think that is ultimately the question that we need to wrestle with as a culture with all of our athletic halls of fame. Are we honoring them for their art, or are we honoring them for their lives? Because if we're honoring folks for the lives that they've lived, I think our halls of fame are going to be
They're gonna be half
pretty
empty.
empty.
Well, that was, I mean, so quickly about Giamatti. He died how many days after? It was very soon after, correct?
8 days.
8 days. So I want, like, for our listeners to kind of understand this, like, who really, so Rose lies to Giamatti, right? He has the chance to admit to Giamatti at the time that yes, he gambled, so on. Giamatti dies a few days later, but Pete Rose had the ability to apply for reinstatement. Was it a year later until they made that rule, or was he still able to apply for reinstatement?
So just to clarify, the initial allegations about Rose reached Major League Baseball's front office in February of 1989. Pete is called to meet with Giamatti, Fay Vincent, and Peter Ueberroth shortly thereafter. That he lies to them. They actually believe him, but because they are aware that the press is digging into this allegation, they know they need to do their own investigation. And so this ultimately consumes the entirety of Bart Giamatti's tenure. I mean, he was officially appointed as commissioner April 1st, 1989. Pete Rose is banned from baseball August 24th, 1989. Bart Giamatti is dead at the end of August. So, the whole time that Bart's in office, he's wrestling, with Pete Rose.
Yeah, and multiple commissioners have kind of wrestled with the Pete Rose issue.
And that question about applying for reinstatement, I mean, that was pro forma. That was just a legal phrase that was going to be in the document. Any permanently ineligible player can apply for reinstatement. So that was in the original document that was signed between the two parties.
It's kind of like a weird analogy, but it's one I thought in my head, like a murderer being able to go for parole all the time. Like, he was able to kind of apply for reinstatement, and commissioners afterwards just not necessarily ignored it, but didn't
But here's the
obviously didn't
thing. I
reinstate him.
mean, you know, again, my reporting shows that if Pete Rose had gone to New York in February of 1989, before any of this was making national headlines, and if he had gone into that room with Bart Giamatti, Fay Vincent, and Peter Ueberroth and his lawyers, and told the truth completely, that uh, Major League Baseball, and in particular Bart Giamatti, who loved baseball and was an empathetic man, would have done everything he could to get Pete the help and support he needs. And let's be honest, America loves a comeback story. And so I do believe that if Pete had been honest from the start, that he would have most likely been back in baseball with as a manager within a matter of just a few years.
Okay. All right. I was kind of like I was afraid to ask you that directly, but you kind of answered it for me. I also don't want to give away. Again, it's very much like I said in the beginning, and we talked about it's you lay it out for the reader to kind of make their own opinion. Um, so in the
Yeah,
course of writing
I
this
guess I
book,
would say like no matter how you feel about Pete Rose, because nobody out there has tepid feelings about Pete Rose. You
Mhm.
love Pete Rose or you hate Pete Rose, and that's it. Um, no matter how you feel about Pete Rose, I think you'll find something in this book for you.
as you write the book, though, how does your, if any, does your perception of Pete Rose change throughout?
You know, I don't know that my perception of him has changed. You know, I think what's happened for me personally is uh, things have just crystallized a little bit more. Um, you know, it was a very difficult book to report because of the access I needed to get, because of the documents I needed to get, because of some of the sensitive issues I needed to write about. Greek tragedy. Pete really was um, sort of a Greek kind of God that we created. He created, and then we created it and made it even bigger. I mean, culturally. And then he absolutely implodes. And so, to write that's really what crystallized for me.
And do you think so? I think this book is so important for people. So I'm 30. Well, I'm turning 30. Brett's 30. I think this book is so important for people our age, which is why I was like I was so excited to read it, and why once it's out, I'm going to make sure to share it. We're going to share it to all listeners. We're going to do give away a copy, because, like you just said, you have to understand the whole story of Pete Rose to really make a judgment on it. Because my entire life up until a few years ago, when I really started getting back into baseball, was Pete Rose gambled, he's a cheater, he's a liar. That's it. And after doing research prior to this, and especially after reading this, like there's so much gray area, and like you said, it's like I don't know. It's just it's so tough. It's like, what's his legacy? Where, like, when it's all set, when he passes, which he's young, he's still young, he's in his 80s, but it's like, where is it just, is it done? Is his legacy over? Is he going to be this guy who just gambled? And I think your book kind of is the opposite of that. It gives the full story where people now can really make their own opinion.
I'll say two things about that. One question that I always like to ask about any great athlete in any sport is, can you tell the history of that sport without that person? How just to use a different example, can you tell the history of basketball without LeBron James or Michael Jordan? No, they're in every story of the last
Yeah.
40 years. Can you tell the story of football without Tom Brady? No, you can't. He or Bill Belichick. They're in every story the last 25 years. Um, and the reality of the situation is, again, no matter how you feel about Pete Rose, you cannot write the story of the last 40 years of the 20th century in American baseball without Pete Rose. I mean, it's not just the gambling scandal. You know, long before that, he seems to find himself on the stage, on the field, in the games that mattered the most, or in the controversies that mattered the most. You simply cannot write the story of American baseball in the 20th century without Pete Rose. So I guess that's number one for me. As far as his legacy. Um, Number two, aside from that, what's his legacy going forward? Well, I would submit this. It's a cautionary tale. It's a cautionary tale for anyone, any person, but certainly any athlete. You know, he did have it all. He was truly beloved in this country. He was an icon, and he sort of threw it all away with his own choices. And that's a very human story. It's one that I think everybody can understand, and I do think in that way it's a very universal story.
I'm gonna clip that because I love that answer. And I think adding that with what you said before, where it's just like if he just told the truth, which is just something that humans just can, like when their backs up against the wall, they seem to. I mean, I'm a middle school teacher, and I'm just amazed how often these kids, when it is just everything's laid right out, they still will lie for no reason. Even an adult male who, like you said, had everything, backs up against the wall, doubles down and lies, which I guess really just kind of shows how human these. I mean, you use the word Greek gods, like, or Greek legends. It really shows how human they are as well. So, I mean, so we'll jump. Brett has a question or two for you that we always ask all of our guests. But again, Charlie Hustle comes out March 26th. This podcast that you're listening to now is going to probably be the week before. So at this point, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, I'm assuming everyone can get a copy kind of everywhere, right?
You can pre-order the book anywhere they sell books.
Yeah, we got our pre-order already on Amazon, so we jumped on that. Brett, you want to jump in with kind of our usual questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So, are there any other sports figures or events you're interested exploring in your future work?
Oh, I love sports stories because I think they can be parables for life, and there's a ton of ideas on my list. Um, I guess I'll just say in brief, like I've just always been fascinated with 1970s tennis. That's sort of another crazy moment in American sports. With uh, Borg and McEnroe and Connors and everybody. It's just a fascinating time. So that's certainly something that intrigues me.
I can
So,
appreciate that.
quick question. Like, what'd you go to school for? Was it history?
I was a history major. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because I just love how like every single book you've written is just completely different from, like, I guess also you could probably just get sick. I mean, the reason I'm saying this is I master's in history. I was working on a book for Theodore Roosevelt because I had to write my capstone. It was like 150 pages, and it just got so monotonous. I was like, I can't read about Theodore Roosevelt anymore. I'm going crazy. And that's kind of when we jumped over to doing the Skipper's View in baseball. And it's like I've now been able to balance, like, I love baseball, I'm reading these baseball books. I've now been able to like kind of like take a step back towards Theodore Roosevelt and kind of working on that. I have like 150 pages just sitting there. I want to do something with
Oh
it.
my gosh.
So yeah, it's a mess. I'm obsessed. So with you is like, where is there that one thing where it's just like you feel like you're gonna keep going back to? I feel like it's probably not baseball, but maybe it is.
Well, to me, it's about human stories. That's what people care about. And so, if you can find a compelling human story, the rest of it almost doesn't matter so much. What world it's in, whether it's a baseball field or an old aviation field in the 1930s from my book Fly Girls that you mentioned at the outset. So that's what I'm looking for, is compelling human stories.
All right, I'll send you my Theodore Roosevelt book, and maybe you can just write it for me.
Awesome.
I'll give you like a bunch of half of it's done. You can just finish it. Right,
keep writing, Dean.
Yeah. No, you've been working on that one for a while. I know you have that Theodore Roosevelt piece.
Well, because you had to write a 100-page capstone to get your degree, to get your master's.
Oh,
So
don't tell. Keith, I'm a sales major. I have trouble writing 2 pages, so this is way over my head about the writing.
yeah, no,
but
I feel like once you commit that much, I just feel like you have to kind of kind of keep going with it. But I did get not writer's block. I just got fatigue, which
I hear
in
you.
reading biographies about Edmund Morris, who his biggest works are the trilogy he wrote about Theodore Roosevelt. Like he had to step away constantly, and go. He wrote about Reagan and a few other people, because you just can't live your life just focusing on one thing,
Yep.
which was very 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 good lesson. Um,
Yeah.
Brett, ask him the question. I love this question. This is how we get all of our
Yes.
interviews.
So, who would you suggest that we reach out to next for this series of interviews? We've been primarily sticking with the baseball author content. We've had pretty good success doing it. We always have fun bringing people on and kind of going through the books that they've been writing. So, come top of mind, join us on the show for an episode.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm thinking about, baseball writers who have books coming out. Um, uh, let's see here. Um, you know, I'm going to give you two different thoughts. The first is, it's called the skipper's view. I think you guys could branch out. I think you look at calling in, like Buck Showalter, and try to get yourself a skipper, an actual skipper. I mean, do you think you have a
So
chance at that?
so weirdly, you never know. We had Dan Evans on, which was a lot of fun, and he's in the baseball world. I have a question for you though, as like someone who has to go and get interviews. Like, what is your process of this? Is a little like behind the scenes. Like, what is your process of getting? I mean, you got however many interviews you got for this book. Like, how would you go about getting Buck Showalter?
I would. He has an agent. I would reach out to his agent. Um, I would reach out to the teams that he managed most recently, and see if they would connect me, um, and that would be where I would start. And that's where I started with a lot of the guys that I found for this book. But a lot of these guys that I interviewed are, in their 70s and 80s. They haven't worked for a team for a long time. Some of them have been forgotten. Some of them don't even have agents anymore. And then I just did my reporter thing, and I would just go off and find them. And if I can find their phone number, I just call them out of the blue. And if I can't find their phone number, but I think I find their address, I'll mail them a letter with one of my previous books and ask them to give me a call. And um, you know, you know, there were certainly people who didn't want to talk about Pete Rose. That happened. It always happens on any project. There are people who don't want to talk. But in general, people like to talk. People like to tell their story. And so
Mhm.
if you reach out, you show an interest. If your interest is genuine, um, people are often interested in talking.
All right, Brett, write down that we're going to reach out to Buck Showalter and that Keith O'Brien told us to, and we'll send him
With
a
that,
copy of Charlie
The
Hustle.
skipper of your
I,
choice. I don't know.
I was
Showalter just came to mind.
I was
No,
gonna
I'd
say
love to
I don't
talk
know.
to him.
I don't know off the top of my head if Showalter is a former player. Just we'll find his baseball card, put it in some a top holder, and send it to him. And say like,
We'll
"Why don't
There
you
you
come
go.
on the show?"
we'll call Jerry
There you go.
Seinfeld because he was on Seinfeld, and then we'll make it that way. We'll go
Yeah,
that
right.
direction.
There you go.
Um, last question. This is just Brett threw this in. I don't know if Brett's like is going to ask you to be part of a fantasy baseball league, but let's see what happens.
No, I always just like to ask. The authors who come in here who dedicate so much time to writing a book about baseball. Being that baseball was the first real major fantasy out there, I wouldn't say we cover fantasy directly. We just really cover baseball in general, all things baseball. Do you play in any fantasy leagues nowadays, or is it kind of like behind you? Or did you never catch the fantasy wave? While it became a prominent staple of fantasy
I
sports.
was definitely into fantasy sports I would say from the late '90s uh, into the early 2010s. After I think the big change, frankly, for me was having kids. and being able to rationalize the time you spent. If I could give any advice to my younger self or any of your young listeners, um, when you're young, in your 20s and 30s, you're not married, or you think, oh, I'm so busy, and it's only later when you have kids and a wife and obligations and a mortgage and other things, you're like, wow, I had so much free time back then. And so I really enjoyed fantasy baseball in particular. And I was in a great league with a bunch of guys at one of my old newspapers for many years. And we had some fun times together for sure.
So, Brett,
Well,
you're gonna ask him to be in a fantasy league? I just want to see. I want to see if that was your angle.
no,
We'll get
I want-
we'll
well,
get at, we'll get
I
Adam
would love to
Lazarus,
get.
Keith O'Brien.
Yeah, I was gonna say I would love to get all of our guests in one league, and we just make a super league full of like super, you know, deep authors in the baseball section. See who could win out a league. That would be
That would be
awesome.
really interesting, actually. Yeah, we could get Poznanski and Mike Lupica and
Dan
um,
Evans, get Dan
sure.
Evans.
Let's just go. Let's go.
Oh,
All right,
Tyler
we're ruling it out.
Kepner. Let's
You're not-
go.
You didn't rule it out, so we're taking that as a maybe. Okay. Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose, and the Last Glory Days of Baseball, March 26th. Keith O'Brien. You can get the book anywhere you get books. And where is the best place? You're on Twitter a lot, or X, whatever we want to say. Where's the best place for our fans to find you?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram.
Oh, I gotta follow you on Instagram. That I didn't realize that. All right, cool. Keith, thank you. Hope to have you on again sometime. Maybe we'll talk. I'm gonna read Fly Girls is my next book to read.
Awesome.
So maybe we'll have you on to talk Fly Girls. So thanks for coming
Fantastic. Thanks for having me, guys. It was my pleasure.
on. All right.
thanks.
Stop.